On April 22, 1930, the London Naval Treaty was signed into effect, and amongst the signatures was Imperial Japan, since they possessed the third largest navy on the planet. With regards to aircraft carriers, the total tonnage allocated to each navy remained the same, which for the Japanese was 80,000 tons maximum amongst all of the carriers combined in the fleet. The gun caliber allowed aboard aircraft carriers was reduced to a maximum of 155 millimeters, which the Japanese had a few carriers in service with 203 millimeter guns, and the definition of aircraft carriers was solidified as being a ship where an aircraft could take off and then re-land on a flight deck. This would end up creating a problem for the Japanese. In the early 1930s, they would have 3 aircraft carriers they considered liable units in service. This was Akagi, Kaga, and Ryujo, all of which were considered experimental failures. However, due to the definition, the experimental Hosho, which was the first purpose-built aircraft carrier on the planet and Japan's first take on an aircraft carrier, it now had to be included in the total tonnage allocated to Japan. This would put the Japanese fleet at 68,500 tons, leaving them with only 12,500 tons to build a new carrier. In 1931, Japan was overviewing a proposal for its first naval replenishment program, which was supposed to include 2 aircraft carriers. However, by the time the program was approved, both aircraft carriers were stricken out of the construction list. The reason the 2 carriers were stricken from the construction list is because Japan was looking to stop carrier construction around the planet amongst all navies. They would end up proposing this at the General Arms Limitation Conference in 1932, and the reason for this was rather ideal in their favor. They understood if they built more carriers, their future enemies would be building more carriers, and they would ultimately not be in any better of a position than they currently stood. However, on the 24th of January 1934, before the Japanese proposals could be finalized, the Japanese delegation left the conference, meaning carriers were still good to be constructed. Later on in 1932, the Imperial Japanese Navy would get whiff of a rumor that the United States Navy was looking into constructing what was being considered a carrier cruiser. This was a ship that could launch and land aircraft, while it also had the main battery guns of a heavy cruiser, and this ended up scaring the Japanese Navy into designing their own carrier of the same type. Something I'll clarify real quick is that the actual name for this classification of warship is the Flying Deck Cruiser. Going back to the Japanese Flying Deck Cruiser, they would end up proposing design G6, which is a fascinating design to say the least. The ship would be 240 meters long at its maximum length, with the flight deck being 194 meters long, and it would have a total displacement of 17,500 tons. On the forward end of the ship, where the flight deck was not present, there would be 3 turrets consisting of 2 20.3 centimeter guns in the Model E turret. They would be placed in a staircase manner, one above the other. The ship would have a total complement, including reserves, 70 aircraft, and its armament for anti-aircraft defense would be 6 dual Type 98 12.7 centimeter dual-purpose guns. The ship would have a large island placed about halfway down its length on the starboard side, and a funnel would curve out of the starboard side, as would become common on future Japanese carriers. The reason the ship would never be constructed is because the Japanese realized that the United States flying deck cruisers were nothing more than rumors, and so they no longer had a purpose in this ship. But there is a severe threat to address. In 1934, the Japanese Navy proposed the second Naval Armament Replenishment Program, with the intention of incorporating aircraft carriers once again, since the Japanese had to acknowledge that their aircraft carriers were heavily outmatched, particularly by the United States Navy's Lexington class, consisting of Lexington and Saratoga, and the newly completed Ranger. As I mentioned earlier, all the Japanese had to bring to the table was their first aircraft carrier and the 3 experimental failures that followed it. Now, before the 1934 replenishment program even became a thing, in 1933, the Japanese Navy had already begun designing an aircraft carrier which would be designated Design G8. Design G8, much like G6, would have a waterline length of 240 meters. However, this time the flight deck was actually longer than the ship. Some of the noticeable changes in the design is the island's placement and shape. It is now 1/3 of the length back from the bow, and it now has a staircase shape which would hold the rangefinders and other vital equipment for fire control. The two turrets located on the anchor deck are 15.5 centimeter low-angle turrets, and the funnel, rather than being the standardized curve off the side, was actually a vertical funnel running out of the flight deck behind the island. The planned air group size, including reserves, was once again to be approximately 70 aircraft. This design would come to a screeching halt when, on March 12, 1934, a Japanese torpedo boat ended up capsizing in rough seas, and this caused a temporary suspension in construction of Imperial Navy warships. A committee was formed to investigate the capsizing, and as a result, stability calculations had to be reworked in Japan, and upon placing the G8 design into these calculations, they found that the 18,000-ton full-load aircraft carrier was too top-heavy and under great risk of capsizing itself if constructed. This was a problem since the Japanese had already ordered and began construction of frames and hull plates for the ship's construction. So the Navy goes back to the drawing board and create Design G9. Design G9 would be a heavily reworked carrier, with the Japanese completely dumping the concept of creating a carrier that had cruiser-like guns and going for a ship solely designed to fight a carrier war. They came under the realization that if a warship ever got so close to the aircraft carrier to where the guns could actually shoot at it, then it has been within the range of the carrier's aircraft for several hundred miles. Basically, big guns were useless in this case. After this, the Japanese turned their eyes back to the heavily outdated Hosho, which is still considered an active aircraft carrier in the Navy, and they design another ship which would become G10 to replace the Hosho upon its completion. Now, I'm sure many of you have noticed that, based off the drawings, G9 would become the Soryu and G10 would become the Hiryu, which are often misrepresented as being of the same class. However, the Japanese Navy considered these two ships to be their only ships of their design, as they are extraordinarily different in many respects, though they are also very similar at the base. In a different video, I will discuss the differences and similarities between these designs in great depth to give a comprehensive understanding to what the Japanese had ended up creating. But, as for today, hopefully you have enjoyed this video. If so, why not leave a like and comment down below, and have a wonderful day.